Yes, hello, and thank you all for tuning in to my talk, and thank you all for the presentations that have gone today so far, all been really interesting, and thanks as well to the British Cartographic Society for putting on today's event. I know there's a lot of planning that goes on behind the scenes, so great to be invited to speak. And yes, I'm going to follow on from the last talk, which looked at 20-minute cities or neighbourhoods, to look at 15-minute cities. So to be more precise, we're going to look at how we've done some research at Sphere to use GIS and to understand local accessibility. And what we're going to show you today is how we've done that in London. So I was trying to think how this project came about whilst I was putting this presentation together. So it's a good 18 months ago, 2 years, when an email popped into my inbox from a colleague who was interested in understanding what 15-minute cities looked like for London. And as we are a geospatial team, we set about trying to work out how we could try and think about how we could understand what a 15-minute city definition would look like, and also what metrics and what data was available out there. So to begin with, we looked at understanding the local population that is currently available, data that we have access to, which is the very easy part. So that's the map that you can see on the screen. But what we really wanted to try and understand is what measures of accessibility already existed, and if they offered the right level of analysis and data that we were really interested in for the work that we were looking to deliver to some of our clients. So we did an initial bit of a data audit of looking at what is available out there in the moment, and there is some good data available. So the index of multiple deprivation has some access to services indices, and DFT also have access to services metrics. But when we looked at some of the services that were included in those data sets, we thought that perhaps they lacked some of the detail that perhaps the analysis that we wanted to do lacked some of the detail that we were interested in finding out. So
can I just interrupt? Sorry,
yeah.
It's just that we're on your title slides still, and it's not going through onto the other slides.
Is that working now?
No, we're still on the first slide.
Okay, let me reshare, because it did say Zoom crash. So let me try again. Is that coming now?
Not just yet. It's it does say you're sharing, but we can't see anything just yet. There we are. Yeah, so we've got the image up.
Yeah, but keep. Hello, can you still hear me?
We can, yeah.
Okay, so yeah, sorry, it keeps saying my Zoom is crashing, so apologies for the technology troubles, but hopefully you can see my screen. Is that still there?
At the moment, it's not sharing, Ollie.
Okay, this is not going as well as I'd hoped. Let me see. Try that one more time. I don't know why this is not.
We can see that. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Let me carry on. So yes, so I've only moved on one slide, so hopefully you won't have lost too much of the detail that we were talking about. So this is the map here that's looking at the local population of London, which we have divided up into little 200-meter hexel grids. And as I was alluding to at the time, we were looking at how we could try and understand local accessibility at a really small granular level to work towards defining a 15-minute city definition. And we did some desktop research to look at the type of facilities that should be included in that analysis. And these are the things that we included. Has my screen moved on?
Yeah, that's all working.
Yeah, good. Right, I think we're in. And this is the list of locations and services that we use to define at a very basic level things that could consider essential and desirable services that make up a definition of 15-minute cities level of services. So we looked at access to education for both primary and secondary schools. We looked at access to food shops and supermarkets, access to green space, access to health services. So that's things like GP services and pharmacies, access to local public transport. So that effectively means local bus stops and bus services, leisure spaces, food and drink. And then as a more desirable things, you should also have access to strategic public transport, so things like railway stations and also cultural spaces. So we collected data for these locations from a variety of data sources, a mix of all survey data, open data, DFT, edu-based data for the schools locations, as well as NAPTAM data sets for showing local public transport and rail stations. And where we didn't have any data, we looked at OpenStreetMap data for finding food and drink locations, leisure spaces, and other things like that. So what we did is we mapped all these locations, got a location for all those services across London and slightly beyond the London boundary, so we could assess access to services that just cross over those over the boundary of London. And we built an active travel network for the entirety of London to calculate walk times to the nearest service that we are assessing. So every one of these little hexels, we have a walk time to all of the services that we assessed, and that allowed us to do some analysis and summarize the data to show across London where people have good access to services that could define what a 15-minute city might look like. So the next slide should, as long as it updates, show us what London's 15-minute cities look like based on the services that we've assessed. So anything in this map which is highlighted the darkest blue shows locations which can reach all the services that we assessed, moving down to red where there are no or limited services that are available. And straight away we can start to see some interesting things that appear on this map. So actually the very centre of London, which people just automatically assume would have access to everything, actually doesn't have access to all the services we assessed. Some of the services that it misses in the very centre are things like supermarkets or access to schools. But then when you think about it a little bit more, maybe that's not such an issue because there's probably not many children of school age living in the very centre of London. We can also start to pick out some strategic centres as well. So we've got Croydon down here, and we've got Richmond over here, and some other locations which are scoring quite well. But we can also see how there are some natural severances that are going on here. So the River Thames here causing some accessibility issues as well. Big green space as well, causing some local accessibility issues, and there's also some transport severances going on in other places which we can look at in a minute. So this is great. We can understand at a quite granular level these hexels are 200 meters in diameter. the types of services that people can access in that area. But what we also wanted to do is we wanted to enrich each of these hex cells with more of the qualitative information that is happening in that area. So we looked at the level of index of multiple deprivation in the area. We looked at general population segmentation data. We enriched each hex cell with public transport accessibility scores, access to car ownership, air quality data. And what we achieved by doing that is to create a central evidence base for London that starts to understand both a measure of accessibility, but also starts to bring that back to the place that we're assessing, so we can try to understand some of the challenges and opportunities that are present in the area. So this slide simply shows the proportion of the population that can access the different services that we've assessed in total. So 26.5% of the London population can access all essential and desirable services that we've assessed. 28.6% can access 9, so they miss one thing, and then it falls away quite quickly. So looking at this, it would appear that London has, as we probably would assume, some great access to local services, but it does actually start to differ when you start to break it down by population segmentation and levels of deprivation, and when you start looking at areas in a local area. So what we can begin to do as well is for each of the services we've assessed, start to understand how much of the population can access that service. And again, geographically look at what locations have access to that service. So the next slide looks at supermarket accessibility. So all the yellow locations can access a supermarket, and all the red areas can't access a supermarket within the 15-minute walking time that we've assessed. Moving on to understanding social demographic differences in accessibility, we used the data from the output area classification data and a version of that for London to look at how accessibility might change by different segmentation types of population. So each of the UK has been split into these 7. I think there's 8 actually, because one of the categories is rural living, but there's not much of that happening in London. So in London we have these 7 groups of people that all share common characteristics. So we've got the group hard pressed living here, for example, which is this yellow line here, consistently scores the worst in terms of access to services. So that's something that policymakers might be interested in understanding, where there are different levels of access by different user needs and user personas. We also had to look at different levels of the index of multiple deprivation data. Again, what this chart shows is that the number 1 is the most deprived locations in London, and number 10 is the least deprived location. And then we've plotted across each of the deciles the accessibility that we've been able to measure for the London population. And again, you can see how that rises and falls across the different deciles. But what we found quite interesting is that actually some of the more deprived locations in London actually have reasonably good accessibility to services. And we think that might be due to the type of housing stock that is present in some of these deciles. So these are probably higher density housing locations. So perhaps distances to walk to other to services is limited, whereas over here you might be more suburban locations or detached houses where the housing stock is of a lower density, so you've got slightly further to walk to services. And this might also be where car use is also actually at the highest as well, at this end of the spectrum. So what our analysis has showed to date is locations in London that does have good accessibility. But just because you can access something by walking to it within 15 minutes doesn't necessarily suggest that you will do it. There are lots of challenges and opportunities and factors that might determine how successful an area may be in terms of realizing its 15-minute city potential. So we have looked at collating a whole load of additional data at each of these hexel levels and at a geographic level to try and understand what some of the local opportunities and challenges are across these. So as I said earlier, we have mapped things like road collisions, the road collision data, air quality data, index of multiple deprivation indices, and also looked at public transport accessibility and also strategic connectivity, looking at travel times from certain locations. So what I'm going to do quickly is have a bit of a deeper dive into two case study locations. So we've picked out Croydon and Romford as two locations that we had a bit of a deeper dive looking at the data that we pulled out. Both outer London strategic centres, outer London boroughs. So we collected lots of different data for these locations. And as you can see here for Croydon, this white circle here picks out the main centre of Croydon. And within this main centre, this is the kind of access to services that we can see. So limited, not everybody can access a secondary school within 15 minutes or cultural services. But it's not necessarily the blue areas that we're that interested in this analysis. The areas probably just outside here where accessibility starts to drop off. And this might be where accessibility starts to drop off, where people may start to prefer to use private vehicles to access those services. So by understanding the characteristics of these outer areas, we can start to see what some of the challenges and opportunities are in these areas. So the next map shows public transport accessibility levels. So PTAL is a London TfL data set that looks at the accessibility of public transport. 6B is the best, so that means you've got really good high frequency public transport services. Anything that is 0 means that there is no public transport, or 1A means that you can access some public transport, but the services are so infrequent that it might not be that useful to you, depending on the type of journey that you are doing. So when we can start to compare the two maps, you'll see, if we go back to the first map here, that the accessibility of this location over here starts to drop off a little bit, but it's also got reasonably poor public transport accessibility. So these areas over here, they can't access their local services within that short 15-minute walk. They probably don't have very good public transport services, so perhaps these people, to get to their locations that they need to, are probably going to be defaulting to travelling by car. And we can see some other locations where that's having an impact as well. So some poor accessibility over here and pretty poor PTAL levels as well. So it's about bringing this data together to try and create a narrative, to try and understand what some of the public the opportunities and challenges are within each one of these locations. Again, something else that we looked at using the index of multiple deprivation is the crime data within that index. Some of the engagement work that we've done with local authorities that were looking at this, this was quite a big factor that they were considering when thinking about 15-minute cities, in terms of how you can make the city or the neighbourhood that you're assessing feel like a nice, safe environment for people to walk through. So having an understanding of the prevalence of crime was felt important, and not just crime as well, from a safety point of view, things like road collisions as well. So we collected road collisions for each of the Excels that we collected. If high accident locations or black spots may force people not to walk, make a slightly longer detour around those locations so they can avoid it. And then when we look at Romford, again, doesn't score quite as well as Croydon in terms of measuring the local accessibility. But again, just outside the area, you'll see that local accessibility does drop off quite a lot as we move into the more residential areas. And also when we start bringing in things like the P-tile data again, we'll see that the P-tile data really does drop off. So that measure of public transport accessibility around this area is really poor, which probably goes to explain why car ownership is as high as it is in these locations, in terms of you can't access the public transport, you don't have access to the services, so your car ownership here is high. But as part of our work, looking at defining what 15-minute cities and neighbourhoods look like, it was important. An important consideration was also to understand the strategic connectivity of these locations, and the types of services and transport services that you can get access to and where they take you to. So we also had a look at looking at strategic connectivity from these two locations as well. And that started to bring out some interesting things. So Romford has a very linear transport network that serves, it's on a main rail line into central London. So you can get into central London really quite quickly, which is great. But actually some of the more orbital routes that you might want to go to some of your nearby local neighbourhoods or other strategic centres, actually the travel times are comparatively high compared to travelling by car, which may, again, if you're not going into central London, you may, with public transport times and access being slightly slow or lower, you might default to using the car. And what's interesting when you look at Croydon and the public transport accessibility and strategic connectivity in Croydon is it has a much wider public transport catchments, and that's because not only does it have good linear routes into London, it also has some orbital routes going around towards Kingston on the tram network and things like that. So this potentially Croydon has other advantages of maybe being able to connect to some of the other regional locations on regional 15-minute cities within London, so you can get to them by public transport rather than having to defer to private vehicle access. And this might be something that is quite important for London moving forward. So as people who work in London know, we're probably travelling into the office less, so less TfL, Network Rail, perhaps are seeing less revenue and less demand going into central London for work. Is there an opportunity for some of these regional centres on the edge of London to maybe start to think about redefining how their strategic transport works, with looking at more orbital routes to connect into their local centres near them rather than just fast access into the centre of London? And all that will hopefully mean that a more sustainable travel hierarchy can be realised, and we stop driving as much as we do where we can. So apologies about the slightly chaotic start to my presentation. Technology is always fun when you're doing things live, but I think what we have managed to do is create a quite simple geographic assessment of local accessibility, and then marry that up to some of the underlying characteristics that happen in that location that you're interested in. What we were quite keen to do as well with the work that we do as a company is to have a methodology that could potentially be applied to other areas quite rapidly and quite quickly. So although we have used open Ordnance Survey open data or some government statistics for some of the services that we assessed, we can sub that data out for OpenStreetMap data, or if a client has anything more definitive, we can sub that out and use that quite quickly. And we have actually applied this this approach to a number of other cities across the UK, including Glasgow, Southend and Manchester and Bristol. And we have also applied it to Mexico City, and I'm hoping next week that we might be able to apply it to some project work in North America as well, which will be exciting to see how accessibility changes by different regions and countries, and also what services we may want to include or enhance or do something slightly differently for those different cities and the different cultures. One thing I would say at the moment is our approach is really great at assessing access to services, but I would like to update the analysis to include the quantity of things that you can access. So at the moment, I'm just putting back the nearest one, but I'd like to just tweak the algorithm slightly to just pull back everything. I don't know, say the nearest 10 services that you can reach, and then we'll get, not only can you do it, we'll understand the quantity that you can reach, because quantity means choice, and the more choice you have probably means that you've got a stronger location, stronger 15-minute neighborhood. And also, as alluded to in the earlier presentation, starting to think about the quality of those services that we are assessing as well. So perhaps you can only access one piece of green space, but if it's very small and not very well kept, that might not be something that you wish to visit. So that is a little bit harder to do. So we're still trying to figure that one out, and that's probably more of a qualitative narrative piece at this point, but hopefully we'll look for other data sources in time that might be able to do that. And I think what's really important to just remember is that, yes, it's great that we can access services within a short walk of our house, but I think people enjoy living in cities because they're fun and vibrant places to be. So having access to those good public transport networks is a real fundamental part of 15-minute cities to enable that travel hierarchy, so you can get to other 15-minute neighborhoods without driving, and also look for those employment opportunities and employment centers, and also access to the more strategic services. So I don't know, things like airports or hospitals or things like that. So things that you might not need every day, but nice to get there by public transport every now and then when you need them. That concludes my presentation. Thank you very much for listening. Happy to take questions, and apologies again for the beginning, but we got there.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for that, Ollie. It's interesting to see how your approach is different to what Amanda and Mike presented. And I think the quantity and quality thing, if you apply that to your methodology, it'll be interesting to see what results you actually get out of that. Good to see. And I have to say, your visuals are really, really good and clear. So it's nice to see that. It really helped explain the story about it as well. Just looking at the questions in the chat, just going to say that Claire's put a link to the steer team, so have a look in there if you want to get in touch with them. Just having a look at this one. Helen's put, so interesting, Ollie, on your point about service quality, have you considered using point of interest data, which includes user review or sentiment scores? SafeGraph and the Data Appeal Company are two great sources for this.
Yes, I have. Well, I haven't thought those two data sources. That's interesting. I was thinking of I've got contacts at for life of me, I've gone blank now. But Google reviews was one thing that I thought of, and TripAdvisor was the other one. So those POI, points of interest data sets, which starts to actually aggregate some kind of review or rating. I think you always have to, I don't know, but you have to try and understand the bias in some of that data, don't you, in terms of what's being reviewed and how that data is captured and how you can use it. But yeah, that is definitely something I'm keen to try and build into it, because then it gets, you're not saying yes you can, but do you want to access that thing, or is it of such poor quality that you're going to go slightly further afield? I can see the next question actually, which was by Tim Osler about 15 minutes. So yes, I built a walking a walk network using using active travel links, so road networks and including paths and things like that. So it is, I use a closest facility query in GIS. So that looks at your location and just pulls back using a walk route the nearest service that you can assume. But I didn't do a cut, so I didn't just say only do it to 15. So if the nearest thing is an hour's walk away, that will come back into the analysis. And one of the things that we have been playing around with for some clients is, and as we've already heard today, it's 20 minutes for some locations, it's 15 minutes for others. Someone once talked about a 2-minute city, which blew my mind. I'm not sure how you can ever get everything on your doorstep within 2 minutes. But yeah, that was one of the things that we wanted to do, is so we could play around with that threshold. And Mike has a question as well. The graph on social demographic differences against the different services. I think you said the source of demographic data, but I didn't catch it. Yes, that was output area classification data, which is based on census data from 2011. So it's a little bit old now, and I'm really hoping that when the new census data starts coming out, that that data set gets updated, because it's been a really valuable resource for some of the work that we do, and it's open source, which is always great.
I see Helen's putting a little plug in there for Carto, so
yeah, there she is.
Worth you checking out there, Ollie.
Yeah, cool. Thank you, Helen.
Excellent. I'm going to have to wrap it up there because time's pressing on, and we've got to get to the next section. So thanks very much, Ollie. That was a really good talk. Really enjoyed it, actually.